It's really terrific for me to be here today. One of the things I love about my job is that periodically they let me out to meet real people and talk to them about the work that we're doing in the centre and that I've been doing for about the last 15 or 20 years on high-performance work systems. I also find inevitably when I meet practitioner groups, I learn a lot, so I'm very excited about the other speakers and what I'm going to hear about today. So when I was asked to come and speak here, I was asked to talk about innovation in organisations to drive performance. There are lots of things that I could have talked about. There are lots of factors that influence organisational performance. But what I want to focus on today in the fairly short time I've got is a set of issues around people and their jobs, because A, that's what I do my research on, and B, it seems very clear to me, particularly in sectors which focus on service provision, that the people and how their jobs are organised and how they're rewarded and how decisions are made are the most important things in terms of driving performance. So I won't be talking about organisational structural issues much. I won't be talking about technology or various other things I could. And I will be focusing on high road solutions. So I'm not talking about the kind of cost-cutting stuff that's clearly happening in all sorts of industries. So what I'm really interested in is what do we know about how organisations can deliver improved performance at the same time as delivering high-quality jobs for the people who work in the organisation. So that's my really fundamental sort of question in all my research. And I'm going to be focusing on principles primarily. So what are the underlying principles which organisations of all kinds that are successful in this regard have applied, okay? Because organisations vary on all sorts of dimensions. So my interest is what are the sort of underlying principles that can be applied to work and employment which deliver positive outcomes. Before I talk about those principles though, I want to very quickly get some audience participation. So I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you about what motivates you at work. So have a look at this list of motivators and I want you to think about which of these is the number one motivator. Okay, these things might all motivate you, but if you had to pick one, the thing that gets you out of bed, into work and gets you trying really, really hard to do a really good job, which would be your number one? So inherent enjoyment of doing an interesting job, a sense of achievement, so doing something worthwhile, feedback and recognition from peers and supervisors or perhaps clients or consumers, the ability to control people and resources, and money. Okay, so just take 15 seconds to make a decision about that. You can only put your hand up for one of them, not all of them. But everybody has to put their hand up. I'll be counting anybody who doesn't put their hand up. I'll be singling you out, okay? Okay, so who would rate inherent enjoyment of doing an interesting job first? Okay, good. Sense of achievement? Good. Feedback and recognition? Okay. So I do this exercise all over the world with all sorts of groups, and normally recognition's more important than that, but the first two are always the big ones. What about the ability to control people and resources? Okay, good. That's really reassuring. In the years I've been doing this exercise, I've had one person put their hand up for that as most important, and they were a university administrator, and so it didn't come as any great surprise to me. And money. Okay? Nobody's in this industry for the lavish rewards of a financial kind. Okay, good. The first two are usually the big ones, okay? And the reason that I start with that exercise, apart from the fact that it's sort of fun and interesting, I guess, to see what people say, is that when we think about organisations which perform really well, at the heart of what those organisations do is motivation of their people, okay? And so everything else that I'm talking about today, I'd like you to think about in the context of motivation. So some features of what I'm talking about relate very clearly to motivation, others perhaps less so. But if you don't have that magic ingredient of motivation in the organisation, it's very, very hard to get good results. And that doesn't matter whether we're talking about the disability sector, software design or transport, okay? The principles are the same. And over the last 15 years or so, I've spent most of my increasingly dwindling research time on looking at these sorts of issues. So I'll draw on my research, although I won't be presenting any research findings. So what are the crucial factors? So these are the three things which we know and have known for many decades drive performance in organisations. Okay, so there's been a lot of research done recently, but you can trace research back to the early 20th century that looked at what makes work rewarding for the people who do it at the same time as delivering good performance. Okay, and the first thing is the nature of the jobs that people do, which we often refer to as job characteristics. And essentially, all of the evidence shows very, very clearly that jobs that are good for people and jobs that people perform well in tend to have a range of activities, so some variety. They involve the use of a range of skills, discretion or autonomy, that is, people get to make decisions to some extent. People do a whole job, not a narrow little tiny bit of a job over and over again. And jobs where people get feedback regularly from doing the job, okay? And this is the complete opposite of the dominant model of work organisation, certainly at least in the English-speaking world for most of the 20th century, which came out of automobile manufacturing. The Ford factory is the sort of emblematic model of this, okay, the opposite of what works for people. So we're talking about the kinds of jobs where people have responsibility, do a whole job, not a little tiny bit of the job, use a variety of skills, and so on. So how do organisations that achieve this do it? There are two main ways. One is organising people into teams, okay? So autonomous or semi-autonomous teams, where a team is responsible for a whole task or job. Okay, and you have a small number of people and they are responsible, they make decisions, they may have targets set for them, they may have budgets imposed on them, but it's up to them how they do the job, okay? And this is present in some organisations, and one organisation I'll talk about a little bit later on has done this fully, but many organisations have made shifts in this direction. The other thing that delivers this is what we call high scope jobs. So these are jobs that have all of the characteristics I've listed there in terms of a range of activities and so on. So people being able to do different things in the course of the day, have some control over what they do and so on. So that's the first thing. If you have work organised like this, people are happier and they're also more effective and they tend to make better decisions, particularly in teams. Teams almost inevitably deliver better decisions than individuals, and obviously that feeds into better results for consumers and for the organisation. The second thing is skills, okay, and I think this is pretty obvious. Organisations that invest in skills for their employees get good results. It's kind of a no-brainer. And particularly in the form of on-the-job training, and also hard and soft skills. By that I mean the technical skills they need to do their jobs, but also the skills they need to take advantage of high-scope jobs or teams. And so that means decision-making skills, communication skills, conflict management skills, all those kind of soft skills which I think have tended to be downplayed a lot in a lot of management theory. Okay, and finally, motivation, which I've already talked about. So what motivates people? Firstly, it's the intrinsic things in doing the job. Okay, so the things you put your hands up for before. We know that when people have jobs of these types, they're intrinsically motivated. They're motivated by doing the job, okay? And that's the most important thing. We also talk about extrinsic motivation in the form of rewards. And I mean, in most organisations, or certainly most private sector organisations, we're talking about performance pay. But organisations use all sorts of different mechanisms to reward people, which will sometimes be recognition, maybe linked to career structures and promotion. But what the evidence shows is if you have all three of those things in an organisation, you'll get much better results than if you have any one of them. They need to work together and I don't like to use the term synergistically because it's used too much, but synergistically, okay? So they work together. The whole is bigger than the sum of the parts would be the simple way of putting it, because all these things reinforce each other, okay? So those are the basic sorts of principles, and when they're applied as a system, they tend to deliver much better performance. So what's the evidence on this? I mean, I think my feeling, and this is what I hear when I talk to lots of different groups, is yes, of course this makes sense. It's common sense that these sorts of things should work. But there's also lots and lots of evidence. And since about the 1980s, a lot of this evidence has taken the form of statistical analysis of large-scale survey data, which is sort of where I came into doing this kind of work. And there have been studies done all across the world, so across Europe, the US, and the Asia Pacific, and they all show pretty much the same thing, which is that if organisations put in place these general principles through different sorts of practices, depending on the industry, they get results. So organisations that use these practices, on average, have more satisfied employees, more committed employees, they have lower voluntary turnover, they have higher productivity, and they have higher product and service quality. And that's unambiguous from hundreds and hundreds of very reliable studies. The other thing that's interesting about the evidence is the same principles apply, okay? It doesn't matter what kind of industry we're talking about. Now, the specific practices will vary across industries. Obviously, teamwork is much more likely, say, in healthcare than in top-end jewellery making, for example. So it'd be very hard to have top-end jewellery making done by a team, whereas healthcare logically can be done by teams. But the same principles tend to apply across organisations. A lot of the studies that have been done have focused on manufacturing, but almost all my recent work has been done in aged care. I did a very large study over 4 years with the Australian Nursing Federation, as it was then, looking at work practices in aged care. Exactly the same patterns emerge in that sector as in manufacturing or software design or anywhere else. So the principles seem to work regardless of the setting and regardless of the specific sort of factors that people, the specific sort of practices that people put in place in pursuit of these sorts of principles. Now, what about the history in Australia? This is sort of the sad bit of the story, but then I'll leave you with some more optimistic thoughts after that. Look, it's very clear that historically there's been very, very limited take-up of these sorts of practices in Australia, okay? These sorts of practices, let alone the kind of radical transformations which you'll be hearing about later on. Australia doesn't have a history of cooperatives, for example. And Australian management, like management across the Anglophone world, has tended to be very conservative, very control-focused. And so these sorts of things have happened in scattered sorts of pockets. So in the work that I've been doing in the Centre for Workplace Leadership, we can find examples of organisations that are doing this kind of stuff. But if you look across the whole country, you find pretty limited sort of take-up. And it seems to me there's actually been a little bit of a decline since the 80s and 90s. So particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, when there was a Labor government federally and a lot of industrial relations reform, particularly around award restructuring, there were quite a lot of demonstration projects in organisations trying to implement these sorts of practices. Since that time, I would actually see the trend as being pushing a little more towards the kind of low road stuff that Caroline alluded to before. So the evidence is pretty clear there that this is not happening across the board, okay? But that doesn't mean it can't happen, okay? We can find examples of organisations which have done these sorts of things and done them very, very effectively. And so I think when we're thinking about our own organisations, the key is to think, okay, well, who's doing it well and what can we learn from those cases? And again, that's why I'm very interested to hear what the rest of the speakers are going to have to say about their own experiences and also to hear from all of you in the workshops this afternoon. And I want to talk about an organisation which I've been doing a little bit of work with recently, which I think is really, really interesting. So this is an Australian bank, which I can't name, but I can tell you it's not one of the big four banks. I can't imagine they would ever do anything this sensible. Okay, so this is a small bank, and what they have done in one of their divisions, so this is a fairly specialised, fairly high-value division, is they've radically restructured. They've gone to a completely team-based structure, okay? So why am I talking about a bank to a bunch of people who work in the disability sector, okay? Two reasons. One is, if a bank can do it, anybody can do it. Okay, banks are really risk-averse organisations. They're very conservative. They tend to be run by people who are trained in accounting. And what accountants want to do is, they're the ones who put their hands up for, we're motivated by the desire to control people and resources. Okay, they don't like this stuff. So this is a division with more than 100 staff and $100 million gross revenue a year. Okay, so high value, reasonably large organisation. So they've completely replaced their standard kind of hierarchical bureaucratic structure with pods. So everybody in this division is organised into pods of 3 or 4 employees who are fully responsible for what they do. Okay, so they have targets set, sure, but they're accountable, okay, for the results. And so I've spent quite a bit of time talking to some of the people here, and they've had to implement the sorts of principles that I'm talking about. So they've changed their work organisation to a team-based structure. They've had to retrain their staff, and they've had to change their reward system. So this is just one example. Now, the second reason I'm looking at it, apart from the fact that if banks can do it, anyone can do it, is there are some really valuable lessons that come out of this that I think are probably worth thinking about if you're thinking about your own organisations and how you might restructure for high performance. Okay, the first lesson that comes out of this case is this wouldn't have happened if they didn't have a CEO who was willing to take the risk. Okay, so he pushed really, really hard for this. He's a very strong, almost scary CEO, but he's a smart guy and he's willing to take some risks in his organisation. So that was the first thing, and he's given the division licence to do this. The second thing is this has necessitated a complete change to the role of managers in this organisation. And that's a really big stumbling block for a lot of organisations trying to do this stuff, because it means managers letting go. Okay, so you go from a hierarchical structure to a bunch of managers who, if you like, are sitting beside the pods. So you still have a guy in charge of the whole division, okay, who's the main person I've been talking to. The buck, quite literally, still stops with him, but the role of managers has shifted from being controllers to what you might call coaches. So their job is to facilitate. Their job is to meet with the teams on a regular basis, talk to them about how they're going, collect qualitative data from them about what's working and what's not working, okay? And that's a really big challenge. The next thing that comes out of this case is they've had to completely rethink their leadership model, okay? Because when you go to a team structure and you get rid of that kind of managerial hierarchy, leadership's still got to come from somewhere. Okay, because things still have to be done. If leadership's about influencing people to get stuff done, it's still got to happen. And that's got to happen within teams. And so what that means is leadership responsibilities have to be shared within the team. Okay, and again, that's something people find really, really difficult to get their heads around, particularly in the banking sector. They've had to change their pay system. Okay, so people still get an individual salary, but rewards are more and more paid at the level of the team. So if the team does well, everybody gets the same reward. If the team does badly, they don't. Okay, so there's an incentive to work collaboratively here. Staff have needed to learn new skills, okay, and particularly the soft skills that I talked about before. So the problem-solving skills, the teamwork skills, and so on. Because they're going from a system where they reported up and had their technical skills to a system where they're going to manage themselves. And finally, and this can't be underestimated as being important, is this makes staff really anxious. Okay? And it makes staff in other parts of the bank anxious and sceptical. So the idea here is if this works in this division, it'll be rolled out into other divisions. And so people in other divisions who are conventional banking people are both sceptical and worried. And that's been a big thing that the organisation's had to overcome. And I think all of these things are likely to apply to any organisation which tries to implement this kind of model. Why, if this is such a good idea to apply these principles, and if I've told you nobody much is doing it, why? Why aren't people doing it? This is something we spend a lot of time on in the Centre for Workplace Leadership, is collecting data from managers and talking to people about why this stuff doesn't happen. I think there are a number of issues. One is a lack of awareness. Okay, a lot of people in Australian organisations don't know about these kind of basic principles, and a lot of people don't have the kind of skills that are needed to implement this, because this does require particularly those kind of soft skills. It also requires an ability to cope with risk and likely failures along the way. Thirdly, an unwillingness of managers to give up control. Okay, this is very, very difficult for people to do in all sorts of organisations. And finally, lack of resources and time. Okay, changing organisations in this way is really, really time-consuming, and it costs money. And that's a real problem for organisations, particularly if you're just getting by as it is. Okay, how do you find the space to do this kind of stuff? I mean, in the case of the bank, they've probably got a bit of money sloshing around they can do it with. But in small organisations under pressure, which I'm sure a lot of your organisations like, it's very challenging to take time out to do this. And so I think that again, that's a challenge. So what would I say in terms of the sort of more general lessons that we might pull out from this stuff? If you read the kind of pop management books which you see on the shelves of airport bookshops, it's magic. Okay, there's a recipe and you just do it, and tomorrow your organisation's transformed. I mean, I hope nobody here believes that, because it's utter errant nonsense. Okay, this stuff is really, really hard to do. Okay, it doesn't happen overnight. Senior leadership support is absolutely essential, as I've already talked about in the case of the bank. You have to get buy-in from everybody. Everybody has to be involved. Attempts to impose this, although strong leadership's necessary, you can't impose this stuff from above. You've got to take people with you. And finally, and I guess this might be controversial in the context of talking about radical innovation, my observation is, at least for organisations which are trying to change themselves from whatever state they're in now, it's important to think about the little things that you can do to start with to get the ball rolling. Okay, we're all constrained in different ways. So the question I always get people to work on when I'm talking to them about this are, what are the things that you can change locally that'll make a difference? Okay, because we all operate within an industrial relations framework and resource constraints and all these other things. So what can you change and what can't you change? Focus on the things you can change.